Welcome to the Cyber Leaders Podcast with me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Line. Now, we're both from the SANS Institute who are kindly backing this podcast. I'm a massive geek, and I've spent my career chasing cyber criminals around the internet.
I'm a massive non-geek. I led cybersecurity policy and operations in the British government, and I set up the National Cybersecurity Centre. And now together, James and I are trying to unpack the world of tech security and all the complicated challenges that it involves.
That's right, Ciaran. This podcast is a voice for security leaders. We want CISOs, security directors, and beyond to build up their knowledge, their playbook of what works, what doesn't, and ultimately secure their organizations more comprehensively and quickly. And we hope make life a little bit more difficult for cybercriminals on the way.
Exactly. So in the last episode with the amazing Jen Ellis, we essentially solved ransomware. So I have a question for you today, James.
Go on.
Who cares about cybersecurity?
Well, I do.
Well, I know that, but you're a massive geek. It's your whole life. And for some reason that only Sigmund Freud could work out, it's become my life too. But we are the exceptions. So I think it would be good to talk about how you get the attention of people who don't pay attention to cybersecurity for a living. They're doing something else. They're running big food companies, energy companies. Could be a small company, a large company, whatever it may be. How do you get them to pay attention? Have you managed it? I don't even know if you have.
On occasion, one might say. Shock, awe, and terror, always an effective strategy.
FUD?
Exactly, lots of FUD.
But we don't like FUD.
Well, look, cybersecurity was long perceived as this little bit of IT hidden away in the corner of the data center. And as the awareness of the threat and organizations' risk profiles have increased, in step one might say, the need for security to be addressed more holistically as a part of business risk has too. So for years, we would talk to security leaders frustrated they didn't have a seat at the table with business leadership, the place they needed to be where decisions could be made about people, investments, security risk, appetite, budget, culture, to create the right outcomes. So over time, that's shifted. And now I talk to lots and lots of CISOs who have that seat and are panicking about how to use it, including in a landscape of increased personal culpability and liability, I might say as well. So look, for me, the key here, if we're really going to go after this, security is business risk. And it's one that has to be handled by leadership, increasingly enforced by regulations, I might add. And so as much as it's tempting to talk in bits and bytes and the latest cool exploit, we have to translate all of this into business terms our fellow leaders can share with us and together tackle. Now, that's not easy for many of us from a nerdy background. But hey, look, if business is difficult, Ciaran, it's going to be even harder with your history. How on earth did you get politicians to focus on it?
Oh, I could go on all day about that, and it was really hard. I mean, for some of them, they thought cyber was this big red button that they could press against others, and they were terribly disappointed when they were told that's not how it worked. So then perhaps sometimes you have to wait for disasters. But look, maybe that's a question for a whole other podcast. Let's focus on the boardroom today, shall we?
I think that's probably right. Although I have to admit, I do like the idea of a cyber red button coming soon to a vendor presentation for sure.
Mate, you have no idea. We'll definitely come back to that.
So look, this is a hard one. I think we're going to need some help, Ciaran.
You mean a guest? Brilliant. And I think you know just the person, because we've gone in-house for this one.
Yes, our very first SANS guest. Apart from ourselves, of course.
I don't think we're really guests, are we?
Fair. But anyway.
Anyway, look, who have you brought along today?
We have the one and only Frank Kim. Now, it's a pleasure to have Frank here, and I'm excited for you to hear what he has to say. Let me tell you why briefly. Frank is a SANS fellow, so he's helped thousands of students learn the technical skills they need to secure their organizations in the cloud. Something pertinent to nearly every organization on the planet, and particularly accelerated with deployments post-pandemic. But he also teaches cybersecurity leadership. He's not academic though. Frank's lived the difficulty of being a CISO at SANS. Imagine telling a bunch of SANS security researchers what they can and can't do. I think he's probably got a few horror stories there, to be honest. But he's done this at other organizations too. He was the CISO in residence at YL Ventures, helping cybersecurity entrepreneurs with ideation and market research. So here we have a guy who's got a foot in security, a foot in business, a foot in innovation, and a foot in the cloud. One supposes two, but despite that, he's still a very down-to-earth fellow. I'm so happy with that.
A foot in the cloud, that is quite brilliant.
See what I did there? SANS fellow, right foot in the cloud, SANS, never mind.
Yeah, you're on fire. Go on.
Indeed, never mind. Frank, Great to have you here.
You guys, this is just too fun. I can't wait to get started here. Amazing.
Well, look, Frank, you and I don't know each other nearly as well as you know James. I mean, he's given a bit of an introduction to you, but tell everybody listening about this brilliant cybersecurity career you've had and how you ended up with all this brilliance working with people like us.
Hey, I love the exaggerations here, so you guys are much too kind. But before I get into the career, you guys piqued my attention. You asked, hey, well, who actually cares about cybersecurity and how do we get people's attention? And I'll circle back to, some of the history here in a little bit. But when millions of Windows computers, not too long ago, went blue screen of death, my daughter texted me. I happened to be traveling. And she said, Dad, what happened with this cyber outage? And so why did she pay attention? She knew she was paying attention because she knew somebody that she cares about is not getting on a flight. She can't necessarily stream everything she wants to stream on Netflix. And the local boba shop is not able to take her orders and make the deliveries.
Oh, that's horrific. The others I could live with, but the boba shop one, that's trauma right there.
That's right. And, boba is kind of like the cocktail for teenagers, right? Just like, hey, I would like a nice, tasty alcoholic beverage. It turns out that generation of teenagers is growing up on boba here. And, a lot of times when I'm talking with people after a beer or two, I don't necessarily ask who cares about cybersecurity, but I ask, hey, who cares about confidentiality, integrity, and availability? And for my own personal exaggeration, I say, well, you know what? Nobody cares about that outside of us security geeks, right? The board, the CEO, other executives, They don't care about that. They expect that we're taking all of that stuff into account, making sure that it's at the appropriate level for the org so that people could go ahead and continue to get their flights and sip boba along the way.
and ideally both at the same time, whilst doing some streaming, possibly a documentary about the rise of boba in young adults. That's a perfect lead-in, Frank, for what we want to talk to you about today. And no one is better qualified than you to do it. It's how to get cybersecurity into the boardroom. And once you've got it there, to get a good outcome. The do's, the don'ts, the gotchas, the things we should be focused on to do this well. So before we get into any best practices, which I'm sure you've got many, to what extent is this still a serious challenge after all these years? And is it getting better or worse?
Very tough for us security folks to get out of that technical mindset. And, kind of going back to a little bit of the history, I got involved in security by happenstance. I actually started out as a developer and engineer building apps and writing a bunch of code back in the day that unknowingly, I didn't know it at the time, had a bunch of vulnerabilities. And I had to go figure out how to fix them. And that eventually led me to getting into security full time all of those years ago. And over time, getting into different areas, testing, pen testing, assessing different systems, different applications, building different teams. And somewhere along the journey, I accidentally happened to get involved with SANS, as many of us in the industry do. And, happened to be at a meeting a long time ago where our late founder, Alan Powler, showed up. And I didn't know who he was at the time. And I just thought he was, well, to be honest, some old guy that sat in the back of the room at the meeting. And, come to find out who he was and all the knowledge and wisdom that he had. And I did learn a couple very important things in my earlier days getting involved with SANS, some of those 17 to 20 years ago. He said, hey, when you are presenting to the board, when you're presenting to senior leadership, there's really only two things that you should be thinking about. Is one, do they trust you? Do they feel the organization is in good hands? And number two, how confident are they that the organization is moving in the right direction? That's basically it, right? How do they actually feel? I heard a story about a CISO did his first obligatory 15-minute board briefing some time ago. Well, guess how many slides he took into that meeting? We know how many you should take.
I was going to say 42. It's always the answer, right, Frank?
That's right. Yeah, life, the universe, and everything. But he even made that mistake. It wasn't 42. He took 30 slides. And his team asked him how the meeting went afterwards. He told the team, I think it went great. I got through all 30 of my slides. And the board said, I never want to see that guy again, right? So he didn't focus on how he made that room feel. That's the main thing. And being able to distill all of that technical detail into the so what, right? Of eventually delivering that boba.
So absolutely love that, Frank. Also loved the earlier bit of your answer where you described encountering and working with SANS almost as an occupational hazard of our profession, which I think will resonate with a lot of people. So, in these examples, it's a bit like cybersecurity as a whole. We've always got our sort of war stories of real disasters, like the guy taking 30 slides and boring everybody to tears and never getting back in the room. So can you think of an example where a corporate team of leaders saw a really good change in attitude about cybersecurity? They really got into it. Something happened within the organization that meant this really worked well. What sort of caused it? What were they doing badly and what changed things?
I haven't necessarily seen personally that it happens overnight. Hey, in a post-breach environment, we've all seen that people are paying more attention. And, while some of that initial shock of that breach happening, right, you get a little bit more buy-in, you've got a little bit more leeway to do things. Now you've got that visibility and you can have more of those conversations. Even in those cases, and especially in regular times, I've seen that the CISO, when briefing the board, the obligatory quarterly meeting, sometimes a little bit more frequently therein, the relationship doesn't happen overnight. I've seen it take a year and a half. After 6 months of meetings, regular meetings, quarterly meetings, and so on, it's only then, right, that, hey, you don't mess up along the way, but then you keep going back to the business message and you slowly build that trust over time. Unfortunately, as adults, right, we have a little bit hard time making friends. My kids, they can go to the park at any time, walk up to anybody else and say, hey, do you want to play? My name's Phoenix. Let's be friends. If I go up to James and we've never met before and I go up to him at a pub, and I say, hey, man, you look like a cool guy. You want to hang out?
Clarification. Do you have boba tea in your hand? Because it makes a difference.
Yeah, that's right. And it's alcoholic. So it takes some time to build up that relationship.
Yeah, I love this point, by the way, Frank. I talked to a security lead not too long ago saying he was having a real hard time with his fellow C-suite in, getting them to kind of connect with his presentation. He was kind of going into the room of rock throwing. And to your point, one of the things he says, hey, do you call these people between the obligatory presentations? Have you bought a pizza and spent 20 minutes with your CFO? It could be pizza, it could be boba tea, or whatever it may require, to understand how they think about the business and how they think about risk, to give you a better means of building a relationship, understanding them, and presenting something that's useful. And they kind of looked at me like I was mad. So the relationship thing, and not just trying to do it in that 15 minutes, it sounds so obvious, but people don't do it.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy, right? I mean, hey, we know that the most important phase of any successful attack campaign is reconnaissance, the recon phase. And that's the same thing that we're talking about here with our internal business, our internal partners, our internal stakeholders. We've got to do that recon on them. What do they care about? What are their top priorities? What's going to resonate the most with them? And having those conversations over time. Usually, in the first meeting, they're not going to tell you that, hey, I'm power mad and I want to build my internal empire. You've got to figure that out for yourself.
Wait, we're not supposed to advertise that?
I had a slightly mad question on that, Frank, in terms of building this relationship if you get it going. What place has fear and scaring people got in this conversation? Because for a lot of people, it's an intrinsically negative subject. It's about a risk they don't want to hear about. But you can overdo that. You can scare them witless. You can almost take away agency from them. You can maybe get away with it for a few years with unrealistic scaremongering and so forth. But at the same time, if they're not worried about something, then they might not take you seriously. So when you're building that relationship, what place does fear and scaring people have in the conversation?
A little bit of a tangent. I once had an interview for a CISO position at a very large American educational institution. I didn't get the job, by the way, but they asked me some variation of that question along the way. And they had not too long ago had a significant incident. So they were looking for a little bit more of that technical, the threat, the FUD, and so on. And sure, while I talked about some of that, I focused on, hey, it's the business that's the most important. And hey, you're going to forget about this in a year, right? Whatever FUD I tell you, that's not going to last. That's not what they wanted to hear, right? Because their mindset was someplace else. So to your point, Ciaran, sometimes we've got to figure out, we've got to decipher what's going to resonate the most with that person. But in terms of long-term effects, say maybe the second time that FUD might still work, but it's not going to work the fourth, fifth, sixth time, and so on. I find what really resonates and has staying power is being able to explain things in a simple way. I once had a board briefing with this financial institution, giving them an update about the threat landscape, how it affected their organization. And I didn't plan for this, but somebody asked a question about supply chain related issues. And I happened to just have a Chipotle burrito for lunch. So I mentioned how, hey, Chipotle's got to worry about their supply chain. Where's the avocados coming from? Where's the chicken coming from? And so on. And kind of made that analogy. And at the end of the session, they said they would never look at a Chipotle burrito the same again. So sometimes it's just making things a little bit more memorable in different ways that are understandable to others.
I love that we're covering boba tea to burritos. I'm going to be hungry by the end of this podcast. That's basically where we're going.
You can see I'm not much of a healthy eater.
I love it.
You look well on it.
Exactly. And Frank, I think you'd have got that job if you told them about the cyber big red button that Ciaran talked about that launches the Terminators at the beginning of this. But look, I tend to agree wholeheartedly. I've once described that there's enough interesting stuff happening in cybersecurity. You don't need to color in between the lines. If you actually focus on educating people on what really is happening, that's actually interesting enough. You don't have to lend over into fear and uncertainty because this stuff is already quite scary, quite fascinating. And I do agree with you. Ultimately, the level-headed, educating business partner is the kind of security leader people want in their business. But I suppose that's a good pivot, Frank. Hey, do you have any view on this age-old issue of whether or not there should be a nominated member of the board for cybersecurity. Does it matter? Do you care? Does it work? Would you write it into company law if you were all powerful and could fix all those challenges with burritos we previously discussed?
The reason that today that is not more widespread is because there are not that many senior security leaders, not that many senior CISOs who also have that business experience. And anybody on the board, the actual formal board members, whether you're the former CEO, a CFO, other executive, they've all got some other business expertise. And we've seen the CIO make that shift many years ago after decades ago struggling with similar issues that CISOs are having today. But we are starting to see that shift. And I think as evidenced by the fact that, hey, CISOs out of the gate now, just this year, I've got a handful of friends that have taken on new CISO roles. But you know what? They also own IT. And we see other CISOs taking on the CTO role, the CIO role, the head of engineering role. And while those are still technology oriented, that's an indication that, hey, the modern security leader, we need to know not just about security, but about technology and how that impacts the organization.
So I think that's the most interesting answer I've ever heard to a question that I have to admit, sorry, James, I normally find quite boring. I had lots of discussions within government about, should we mandate this or that and so forth.
Harsh but fair.
Harsh but fair. But also to retaliate or maybe to compensate, I'll probably ask another question that I find quite boring. So hopefully you won't. Does it matter who a CISO reports to? Chief exec, chief CTO, CIO, other three-letter acronyms beginning with C. Does it really matter what place they've got in the organization? Or do you think whatever works for the company, or you haven't really thought about it because you're as bored by the topic as I can sometimes be?
Hey, it's still a hot topic. I have friends that say, hey, I will never as a CISO report to the CIO again because of the natural conflicts of priorities that we know about. But I'll give you the boring answer for the boring question. It depends, right? And it depends on the person's maturity and the organization's maturity. Security, in my experience, can only mature as much as IT is mature. If you got immature IT processes, you're not going to be able to make as much progress as you would like. And so as a result, in those immature organizations, we see security, the CISO, typically more reporting up to the CIO or some other technology role. And then if you, as the individual heading up the security program, if you're not maybe that seasoned or mature in your career and can navigate not just the technology, but the personal, the political, the various emotional aspects of the job that come into play, and most likely you're naturally going to be relegated to reporting still to the CIO. But even if you do, if you're a more mature senior leader, then it doesn't necessarily matter who you report to. While still some of the structure does have its impacts, you're going to be able to find a way to navigate around that and make you and your team as successful as possible. And maybe over time, because of your success, you will find yourself reporting to somebody else. Could be the general counsel, could be the CFO, could be the CEO. Now, it's not all it's cracked up to be to report to the CEO. I met a guy at a very large global car manufacturer. He was one of the divisional CISOs who reported to the global CISO. The global CISO, who was reporting to the CEO, said, you know what? It's not all it's cracked up to be. They started the conversations to downgrade the reporting structure to have that global CEO report to the CFO instead, who also reports to the CFO, because they didn't want to continue to deal with all of the politics, the jockeying, the backstabbing. They just wanted to focus a little bit more on the security. So there are definitely pros and cons.
It's so hard to generalize this stuff, but I think there's a lot of wisdom to that, Frank. There truly is. And of course, if we draw enough dotted lines, it doesn't matter who reports to anyone else. We could just make this like a web or something. Having said it's hard to generalize, I'm going to put you on the spot super briefly. So lots of security leaders are finding themselves in a position of greater attention, importance, recognition, more of a spotlight than ever before. And in some cases, even this risk of personal liability. What do you think, generalizing horribly, are the three most important things for a security leader to be able to do their job effectively in an organization? And I know that's mean because I've given you no specifics of this hypothetical organization. We could say they make boba tea and burritos, but pick three for me that you think people should really pay attention to.
Well, I'll give the high level in terms of kind of three tips, and then we can dive into some more of the details. Is number one, as we've been saying, know the business. Now, number two is have a plan, have a roadmap, have a strategic plan. And number three is, of course, know the technology. The first big executive job that I had, I showed up and in my mind, I was like, I got to build out the team. I got to hire and find the best security talent possible, the best directors and so on. Well, I showed up and there was a person that was working there and she happened to be the chief of staff for the security organization. And that was the luckiest turn of chance that I ever ran into in my career because she knew all of the stuff that I wasn't at the time necessarily good at in my first big executive job. All of the the business, the finance, the communications, right? Stuff that I could do and had done in prior roles. But for this large organization, it required even more focus. And so she really helped run the business of the organization itself. So I've got friends, CISO friends, and they say, hey, when I took my first CISO gig at this large organization, they thought the same thing as me. Hire the best security talent possible. But in retrospect, they said, look, I needed a head of a PMO. I needed a chief of staff. Whatever the title is varies from organization to organization. But in retrospect, they said, while hiring the best talent, I would have made that one of my first hires as well. Now, I have some friends who I've told this to, but they misinterpret it because they work at a smaller company. They've got a 5-person security team, a 10-person security team at a technology-focused company, and they go hire the equivalent of a chief of staff. Well, you can't have 1/5 of your team be a chief of staff, right? So they didn't understand, hey, it's stage dependent on the maturity of your team, but they had a good intention.
Absolutely. Not enough staff to be chief to. That was really fascinating. And there's a question I've got to ask you. I described some of the previous questions as boring, but they're such hot topics. They're always debated that we have to cover them. There's one that really does interest me and links directly to what you've said. In your view, does the person who sort of bears the title, even if it's not CISO, something else, but the highest ranking full-time cybersecurity officer in an organization, does that person always need to be technical or does it depend? And I declare my interest because I actually argued against my own appointment in the British government because I didn't have a technical background. James is one of the very technical people who helped me a great deal and gave me some credibility that I probably didn't deserve. So I'm not pushing for a particular answer, just really interested in your perspective. Does the person need to be technical who's at the top of the cybersecurity tree in an organization?
He's a fast learner, Frank, a dangerously fast learner.
In a very large organization, I would say no, right? They need to have enough cybersecurity knowledge to be able to understand directionally what the team is doing, where the team needs to go, right? In a very large organization, there's going to be key trusted deputies to help do all of those things. I know many examples, right, in large Fortune 500, Global 2000 orgs where the CISO is not technical and they are very successful. And the senior leadership puts them in that position because they want somebody trusted that, as we've been saying, understands the business. We already established a little while ago that there are very few security folks, CISOs, that know enough about the business. Well, and the business realizes they need that. So where do they go? They bring in somebody else. It's easier at that level to train for some of those security basics than it is to train for the business understanding itself. Now, in a medium-sized, smaller organization, a technology-focused organization, again, depending on the stage, right, they're going to have a little bit more technical aptitude to have the credibility of the team and to work with the other parts of the org that are more technically driven. I'll give you an example. I was brought into a consulting engagement at a startup that had achieved $1 billion valuation. So they were doing pretty good, but they're still a startup. About a year prior to me talking with the CEO, they hired their first CISO. By the time I was talking to the CEO said, Frank, hey, we're having this problem. I feel like the CISO that we brought in a year ago really pulled the wool over our eyes. He knows we're a startup, but he immediately came in and said, hey, we need to spend $350,000 on an expensive EDR tool. We need to establish a 24/7 SOC. We need to hire a director of security operations reporting to me to build out that SOC. And they said, well, that's not what we had talked about before. Are we sure we really need all this? So I said, hey, well, how many employees do you have? They said, I forgot what, some 200. Well, how many of you guys are all in the cloud? How many cloud VMs? How many cloud servers do you have? They told me some relatively modest number in the thousands. And I said, hey, have you had any security incidents before? They said, no, not that we know of. And well, who knows, right? So the problem was that CISO had brought his enterprise playbook to that company and it wasn't stage appropriate, right? So it really depends. There's other ways you can solve these questions, get your SOC 2, get your other certifications to help the organization, sell more of what they were selling. So he didn't realize that at that stage, 70% of his job was more sales enablement. 30% was doing the right amount of security in the cloud using those cloud native solutions and services to then make sure that, hey, he can talk about the 70% of how he's supporting sales.
Fascinating. And sorry to keep dominating the questions, but we've talked a lot about the way CISOs should behave and what sort of people they might be and so on. But I'd be really interested in your perspective on what good practice looks like from the top of the organization. So the CEOs, the chairs, the non-execs, the other board members, if this is going to work, they're going to have to play their part too. So what do you want from them in the board boardroom conversation? What do you want to see from them when they're approaching a subject that, let's assume, as in the majority of organizations, most of them don't know a great deal about? What's a good conversation from corporate leadership to the CISOs? What does that look like?
It goes both ways. The best CEO conversations I've had is where it's more like, hey, so we're having this issue. We're going to move into this new area. We're doing this new thing from a business perspective. Or, hey, this is happening to our competitors. What do you need, right? So those types of conversations are the best. But on the flip side, the typical thing that a security person asks a business leader is, what keeps you up at night? And while that's not a horrendous question, I don't think that's the best question, because they don't necessarily know what we do in security, what could keep them up at night. What do they know? They know what keeps them up at night from a business perspective. So the better question to ask is something along the lines of, so, hey, what do you consider to be the most important business processes in the organization? Because that's then going to tease out, right? Hey, downstream, what's the data? What are the systems? What are the data flows that we might need to take more into account from a security perspective? If it gets to that point in the conversation, you could ask something like, hey, so if you were to unexpectedly have to leave your job involuntarily in a year, what do you think might have caused that? Right? So to tie that back to what matters for them and what matters for the organization, that's where the conversation I found is the most fruitful.
Well, I think tying what matters to them and what matters to you tees up our next question quite well here, Frank. What about this very long-running discussion about metrics? I mean, boards love metrics, right? A big board pack full of colorful charts and numbers, particularly if there's a green dashboard as opposed to a red one. Love a green dashboard. But we're not very good often in cybersecurity at producing meaningful ones. Is that right? Is it getting better? Does it matter?
Yeah. Hey, it's all correct. What you said, it matters. We need them. We've got to share them. Unfortunately, like other parts of the organization, finance, we don't have necessarily a set of known metrics. Hey, what's our revenue year over year, right? What's our annual recurring revenue, right? Things like that. And so we've got a couple different standard ways to approach the quote unquote metrics or what we communicate. One is the kind of maturity-based approach. And that's like, hey, we're at a level 2 out of 5, and that changes on an ongoing basis. And you usually need somebody else to come in and assess that for you. But that is just giving you some sort of indication of some type of maturity. It doesn't mean you are the most efficient, the most effective, that you're necessarily improving in the right places or the right ways. So I like to separate it up into 3 different categories. You've got that mountain of technical metrics that all of our tools spit out, that they still spit out all of those, for example, IP addresses and corresponding vulnerabilities. Those are things our team needs to be knowledgeable about, understand, and improve on. And I have made the mistake. If only somebody had told me this many years ago. And it's that saying, just because you have a hammer doesn't mean everything's a nail. I had taken those technical metrics spit out by the various tools we had and shown them to senior leadership. And as you can imagine, those conversations didn't go well. But what I've always had to do is translate those technical metrics into different operational metrics, operational insights. Is how does the team get better to reduce for something like that window of exposure, right? What's our SLA? What's our patch frequency? Things like that. But then even then, especially in a large organization, senior leadership doesn't care about those operational metrics. They assume we're improving and we've got all of that stuff handled. They might care about the quote unquote executive facing metrics. What is that one thing that they should pay attention to? Like perhaps a window of exposure compared to by business unit, so that they know, hey, how is one area doing in relation to another? And there's an implication because they know what the different business units do. Hey, well, maybe that's a little bit riskier. We should pay more attention to that because that's closer to our crown jewels.
There's some fantastic advice in there. And one thing I want to underline is an interesting phenomena. A lot of cybersecurity leadership, and in fact, I think leadership wisdom generally, it can often sound patronizingly simple, like, well, just because there's a nail doesn't mean I have to hit it with this hammer or your equivalent. Although I got one wrong the other day. I said like a hot chicken through butter. That was a personal favorite of mine. Very, very smashy and messy. But this stuff can sound obvious. And yet, when rubber meets road, I still find so many board decks packed with irrelevant technical measures that don't consider that important executive metric or what it means to the business or the lens of the reviewer. So I want to underline what Frank's saying is, even if it sounds sometimes a little obvious, people don't do it. And if you do, it works. So a little follow on for me, Frank, and then I'm going to get out the way because I know Ciaran will have more questions here for sure. Look, one of the big challenges for the CISO, how do you convince boards that you're anything other than an overhead, a percentage that invariably grows with the business that costs money? Should we convince boards that we're anything other than an overhead? How do you think about that and kind of value justification, the approach that people should take? And I do acknowledge it's different in different organizations. But again, general advice me for Boba Tea Burrito Inc.
Hey, I like what you said about kind of those common leadership axioms. And the one that I always kind of go back to similarly, while it might be common sense, it's not necessarily always common practice.
I'm buying.
Oh, that's going on a t-shirt, Frank. Ciaran, we've got another t-shirt.
Can't wait to get my version. Yeah. And so when we're thinking about how do we approach it, in the day-to-day, we get bogged down in all of the fires, the emergencies, all of the technical details, as the team rightly needs to do. But if we take a step back and look at our portfolio of security capabilities, we want to roughly say, hey, what percentage of those activities that the team is doing, are they kind of run the business type of activities, like the keep the wheels on the bus, keep the lights on type of activities? The less mature teams are 100%. But there needs to be some percentage of that work that is the quote unquote transform the business activities. And I always like to try to get that in the 20% versus the 80%, the typical 80-20 rule. And I might not always get there. Sometimes it might be 10%, sometimes it might be 7%, what have you. But the idea here is, hey, how can a security team that is on its way of figuring this out, get to figure out what is part of that 20% that transform the business? A simple way is to say, look, what are the most well-funded IT projects? The most well-funded IT projects are usually a reflection of what the business has said. Hey, we care. These are our most important processes as represented by these systems within which we are trying to codify these most important business processes, like money transfer, electronic health record, sales, e-commerce, whatever it might be. Then say, okay, which elements of that can we in security support? How can we do our review, assessment, security controls, implementation? Can we do it faster? This is why we hear so much about digital transformation, the move to the cloud. Because, hey, those things do wind up supporting those transform the business type of activities. That would be kind of one way to get started, figuring out what's most important to the organization.
So this is such terrific advice and analysis. As James said, I do have lots more questions, but we can't possibly impinge on your and listeners' time any longer. So all I would say is you're clearly cut out to be a brilliant head of the SANS CISO network. You'd be much better than the current incumbent, but we've got to bring this to a close. So as promised, and at the end of every episode,
I should point out, this is actually my idea.
James keeps saying it's only fair if we ask people to come on the show and we ask people to listen, we give the listeners something useful at the end.
So Frank, on that basis, we are asking you for
your 30-second takeaway.
So Frank, given what you know and what you've seen, if there are people listening to this who are in charge of defending organizations, cybersecurity, and there are for sure, what is your 30 seconds of advice to them? It could be a do, a don't do, a bullet list of 3, whatever you like. But let's try and help these folks protect their organizations better. 30-second timer. Go.
You guys are tough, ending on a tough note here. Hey, we talked about the recent blue screen of death hitting Microsoft computers worldwide. And we know that that was not security focused. But to me, that's an indication of the need for security leaders and CISOs to mature beyond just the security capabilities, to understand what's going on in the rest of the org, IT overall. So get ready to be better at the job you have today. And as a security manager, as a security leader, security officer, you might be leading other areas in the future. Get ready for the job you might have in the future, right? Like perhaps in other areas of the org in IT. And also get ready for what that might bring you. Get ready for those opportunities for supporting the business as a whole. That's it.
A well worth 30 seconds, a great listen. Frank, thank you so much for sharing your very considerable expertise with us.
Thank you guys for having me. Really appreciate it. Fun conversation. Thanks a lot for keeping it entertaining.
Absolutely, Frank. I'm looking forward to my order of boba tea and burritos from your next startup. I'm sure there's an incubator somewhere you could pitch on that one. And as Ciaran said, wonderful content and things that if people step back and think about can change the outcomes of their roles of their organizations and change how security is perceived. And that's powerful stuff. But look, we've taken up too much of your time. You're probably supposed to be somewhere teaching some students about cybersecurity leadership or how to harden the cloud or DevSecOps or something like that. So we should probably let you go. Hope you'll come back soon.
Absolutely. Cheers.
I just think that was an amazing set of insights for our listeners, Ciaran, from Frank there. Just incredibly valuable stuff.
And now we know how to talk to boards, why don't we have a different conversation next time with the CISO of one of the most complex organizations in the whole of the United Kingdom, if not the world?
Well, you know what they say, Ciaran, shoot for the stars and you might just land on the moon. But for today, I think that's it, right?
Apart from feedback.
Yes, as always, we need your feedback. We want to put people onto this podcast that will help you make your organizations more secure. So send us some notes and ideas.
Go to the podcast site or email cyberleaderspodcast@sans.org.
So ultimately for today, Thank you for listening.
Keep cybering.
So from me, James Line,
And me, Ciaran Martin.
cheerio for now.